Hello everyone, my name is Saul. I am a graduate from the MFA program at Colorado State University. My emphasis is in graphic design, and this artist talk will relate to the work that I did during my 3 years in the MFA program. I titled this presentation Wander into Wonderland because throughout the whole program, as I was learning new philosophical theories, I I became fascinated uh, with some principles of and how objects are alive in some sense. My work investigates the presumption that objects relating to humans are part of a more significant philosophical discussion. This philosophical framework is proposed by an American philosopher called Graham Harman, and it's called object-oriented ontology. And this theoretical foundation explores the acknowledgement that by not thinking about the sum of the parts of the objects or the already cultural meanings they have, one can experience new relationships they have with their environment and the surrounding objects. I kind of based my framework into three areas, which is the artist, the work that I create in the world, and how they relate to one another. My intention is to kind of see it in a way that you start with very three distinct kind of separations, and at some point with this theory that Harman proposes that uh, there's no really a separation between subject and object. Everything can be considered objects, whether they're thoughts, ideas, imaginary creatures. They all fall into the same category. And I continue to kind of see it in a way that everything is kind of blend together. So there's not really a big distinction of what is happening. It's just the way that we perceive objects are more um, they're not they're overly embedded with things that we don't really think about, like the most of the meanings they have is because somebody has said it before, and you don't have enough space to come up with new interpretations on how you perceive these objects. Think of it as having a big influence uh, on you from the world. Like the world is telling you how to think, the world is telling you how to experience these objects, and you're not necessarily contributing to any new meanings of these interpretations. So when you're making work or experiencing work, like all of these influence kind of just take over in a sense. Everything that comes out is like this mix of language and influences, but then all of these kind of thoughts, they're not necessarily new, and you don't really think about the perspective of the objects themselves. Like this is something that has been already said to you, uh, that was said to your parents or your friends or your teachers. There's not really an opportunity for you to kind of discover new meanings of these objects. So one of my ideas is I propose that as an artist and as a viewer, that all of these signals and semiotics kind of remain somewhat inconclusive. That these relationships we have with living and non-living objects avoid these cultural norms, avoid these very clear kind of messages. Some of the work that I started doing in the program explored this in a different way. This work illustrated feelings. I not only did I use more for a technical practice standpoint, I also use it as a visual journal to kind of record different events and different memories. But at the same time, I wanted to explore what would this be if there were new interpretations. So I moved on to kind of using more ambiguous work, and this is kind of the same composition. All of these are uh, graphic design pieces of work that have been manipulated digitally. But this piece called Distant Memories kind of talks about this idea that if you can't release something clear, your brain and your interpretation is going to start to think about new things. Like the less context that I give you, is the more opportunities for you to express new thoughts about the work. And it all goes down to language and personification. Okay, the way that we make sense of of the work and pretty much everything that we see in the world, it's because of these things. Uh, but in relation to my work, the way I see language and personification is that there's a very clear um, a very clear way that we interact with objects. So there's objects that are positive in our lives or negative in our lives, and there's some sort of emotional reaction towards them. So I love this image because it kind of exemplifies one of the movies that I really like. But this is a way that you can say that there's definitely sometimes that you just hate an object, and if that kind of prevents you from enjoying a piece of work or making new interpretations of another one. I also began to explore new different kinds of languages. This is something that I created using an EKG sensor. So by kind of using different kind of movements, I create an alphabet which can then be turned into some sort of secret code. And I created this piece as a way of kind of embedding hidden messages to see if whoever experienced this kind of work is capable of making new assumptions for this. Now it takes me to the end of my thesis work, and I really want to explore how by making very small changes into objects that are like highly used and known by everybody, is that if they can trigger certain needs for us to intervene, if they can trigger some sort of ideas that can expand this way of experiencing the objects. The thesis work that I present is called Dinner for Two. So Dinner for Two is a series of tables that kind of challenge this principle of eating. So the fact that it might seem like unfunctional tables, at the same time they're not. They're just meant to be used differently. They're not meant to serve the needs that you want. And this is a good way to kind of challenge this conception that the work it's in relation to what we want. So if the work itself is different than what we're used to, this is why I'm hoping that whoever experienced this kind of sculptural work, that if they can kind of put themselves in the place of the object, right? If makes you think, why was the table like this? Why is it changed like this? What are the signals that it's giving me? So overall, my work explores this kind of confrontational way of, I would say, even like putting myself in the shoes of the object. And if these are objects that are being used, if these are objects that are kind of misinterpreted, what could it be the things that they are trying to say, and how is it that they're wanting to say it? So I hope this was really helpful, and thank you very much for listening.